Thank you for joining us today in this workshop, which is about role of informed consent in ethical data collection, sharing, and reuse. My name is Hina, and I work as a senior research data officer within the research data management team, and we are based at University of Essex. This session will include presentation, and as I mentioned, slides will be provided after the event. There are some activities. I think I will just use Mentimeter in the beginning of the presentation, and then there is an activity on the Padlet at the end of the presentation, and then I have added another Padlet for the Q&A. If you would like to share your thoughts on any one thing you hope to learn or further develop by the end of this workshop, this will enable me to amend the content or plan some new workshops for our autumn term this year. So that's really important. So best practices. Hopefully I will cover that, and the activity on the Padlet. At the end of this workshop, I have added some consent form statements that we encounter every now and then when researchers deposit data with us. So hopefully those consent statements will help you to understand what sort of statements should be avoided if you plan to share data. And yeah, so hopefully I will cover best practices, expanded knowledge, getting up to date, best practice for information sheet and consent form. Hopefully I'll cover that, and developing guidance for colleagues. Yeah, so AI is I think the hot topic these days. I haven't added anything related to AI in today's workshop, but we are planning to include it in our future workshop because workshops, that is something that needs to be included in the training workshops. That is the new trend, I would say. So right way to collect data. Sorry about that. And data collection and sharing abroad. I haven't covered international data transfers in today's workshop, but it is in the pipeline. We will be including it in our autumn training workshop series. So guidance for colleagues dealing with sensitive data. Yep, confidence. Greater understanding of ethical data collection. Okay. So possible use of AI in treatment of data. All right. Thank you very much for providing me with the topics that could be, I think, included. So just a question. What do you think? Why we seek consent in research? Any thoughts on that? I know you must be aware that we do obtain consent for research participation, but any other thoughts or something along these lines? Ethical process requirement, yes, that's right. To meet our ethical responsibilities, avoid exploiting participants, that's true. Best practice in research ethics, legal requirement to get clarity around what we can and cannot do, that's right, exactly. To inform participants how their data will be used, that is true. Yeah, to inform participants that they have a right to participate or not. How their data will be used. Yes, that is absolutely fantastic. Ethical and moral obligation to research participants. That is true. To give participants assurance that the data collected will be used appropriately. Yes, help establish trust to ensure participants understand what is expected of them. by participating in the research. Yes, that is absolutely true. Thank you very much for your responses. And I think that is all. I won't be using Mentimeter again, as far as I remember. So, yeah. So let's begin. Thank you for your responses. The overall aim of this session is to show you the role of informed consent in sharing data within ethical and legal boundaries. And I aim to cover the following in this session. Uh, in the first section, I'll talk you through why to seek consent. This section will focus on introducing the use of informed consent in research. And the second part of the session is about how consent can be obtained, covering documentation and methods that are used to obtain consent, and finally, how to manage the obtained consent forms. And this is then followed by a section on when consent could be sought during the research process, and some of the important aspects that needs to be considered are also discussed. And final section focuses on sharing with you some of the wordings used in real consent forms by the researchers who deposited data with us, and example consent forms and information sheet. And I will finish it off by highlighting some best practices and resources that can be very useful for you if you're interested in data sharing. And as I said, please feel free to add your questions on the Padlet. Feel free to ask if you again need a link to the Padlet for the Q&A, and please avoid asking questions in the chat because it may get lost. I'll just go through the Q&A on the Padlet, and yeah. And if you have any specific project related questions, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to get back to you. And you can get my email address on the last slide. So yeah, I have already asked this question so that you don't have to go to the Mentimeter again. So as you have mentioned that informed consent is the process by which a researcher discloses appropriate information about the research so that a participant may make a voluntary, informed choice to accept or refuse to participate in the research. And in the research context, as some of you have mentioned, that consent is obtained to ensure that participants understand what they are signing up to and making participation and research more effective. And it also ensures that the research conducted is ethical and compliant with the data protection regulation. So, in the research context, we need consent for two purposes. Consent for research participation, which is considered as one of the founding principles of research ethics. And as I have already mentioned, and some of you have also mentioned, that it is sought before participation in any research activity. And the second purpose is it can also be used to comply with the data protection regulation. If a researcher collects, manages, and shares personal data, then consent of the data subject can be used as a legal basis to process this personal information under the UK GDPR. So in the upcoming slides, I will talk you through to the role of consent for processing personal data. So forget about ethics for now. So the upcoming slides will be around the role of consent for processing personal data. There are two main legal frameworks that relates to identified or identifiable individuals, the common law or duty of confidentiality and data protection legislation. So some of you who have attended the last week workshops may have seen these slides, but there may be some people who are new to this, so that's why I'm repeating it. About duty of confidentiality and data sharing. So in the UK, there is a duty of confidentiality that is based in common law, and that occurs where confidential information comes to the knowledge of a person in circumstances where it would be unfair if it were then to be disclosed to others. So there are some exceptions when you can disclose information. For example, if participant consents to onward sharing of their personal data, then sharing does not breach duty of confidentiality at all. And sometimes public interest can override duty of confidentiality, and occasionally there may be some instances when you may need to give up data, such as upon a court order, and it is always advisable to avoid very specific promises in consent forms. And you will see what I mean by this when we go to the Padlet for that consent form statement activity. Um, as researchers, you must adhere to data protection requirements when managing or sharing personal data. And I'm sure you are all familiar with what personal data is, but just to give you a quick introduction, that it is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. And people can be identified directly or indirectly. Some of the examples of direct identifiers are name, address, postcode, telephone number, voice, picture, while examples of indirect identifiers could be occupation, geography, unique or exceptional values, any outliers in the data. So if the personal information about people is collected or used in research, then the UK General Data Protection Regulation applies. Or you could just say that data protection regulation applies. And just to mention that anonymized data is not personal data. So the UK GDPR does not apply on that if it is effectively anonymized. So UK GDPR is the EU-wide data protection regulation, not EU-wide, but GDPR, you can say, is the EU-wide data protection regulation that was introduced in 2018 and replaced UK Data Protection Act that was used until that time. But after the Brexit, it is now called the UK GDPR here in the UK. So if the researcher based in the UK collects personal data about people anywhere in the world, or a researcher outside the UK collects personal data on UK citizens, then DPA and UK GDPR both applies. However, if the researchers are undertaking research projects which span across the EU, then EU GDPR will also need to be considered, and it will apply if researchers are collecting personal data. So according to the UK GDPR, there are 6 lawful bases that can be used to process personal data. These are consent, public interest, legitimate interest, protection of vital interest, legal obligation, and performance of a contract. However, in the context of research, the first 3, consent, public interest, legitimate interest, are the most applicable grounds for the processing of personal data. Information Commissioner's Office, ICO, advises that for almost all the research conducted in the UK organizations should rely on either public task for all public bodies, for example, NHS, universities, UKRI funding bodies, etc., or legitimate interest for non-public bodies, which are charities, commercial companies, and so on. So these are the 2 that has been advised by ICO to be used here in the UK. And some of you may be surprised that ICO does not advise using consent as a lawful base. It's public interest for public bodies and legitimate interest for non-public bodies. So, apart from being good scientific practice, in some countries, gaining informed consent is mandated by law. For example, here you can see that some countries have mandatory requirement to obtain consent if you collect personal data. However, there is no legislative requirement for consent to be sought from participants in the UK. But funders or research ethic committees and ethic guidance bodies, they may ask you that they require it, but there isn't any legislative requirement. And bear in mind, I am talking about consent as a lawful basis here and not as an ethical obligation. So that don't get it that in the UK you don't need consent from the participants for your research project. It's not about ethics, it's about consent, about when you use it as a lawful base to process personal data. Sorry. So now the role of consent in the first one was about the role of consent as a lawful basis or addressing data protection regulation. This section is about the role of consent in ethical data collection, sharing, and reuse. It's all about ethics. Consent for participation in research is a fundamental principle of research ethics and must be obtained before any individual becomes involved in research activities. Uh, this process applies universally to all participants. You must be familiar with that. So, this is because to ensure their rights and autonomy are respected. Informed consent typically includes providing clear and comprehensive information about the purpose of the research. So participants understand why the study is being conducted. And it also outlines what participation entails, including any procedures, time commitments, any expectations, and so on. And participants are made aware of potential benefits such as contributing to scientific knowledge, any risk as well, such as discomfort or privacy concerns, any risk, or you could think of any benefits that are project specific. So they are also informed of the procedure to withdraw from the study at any time. And it also details about privacy and confidentiality to assure participants that their personal information will be handled securely and only used in accordance with ethical and legal standards. So, first purpose is to inform the participants about all the information about research participation. So, in addition to obtaining consent for participation, it is essential to inform participants about the use of the information collected during that research. And sorry, this includes a clear explanation of what specific data will be gathered, how it will be stored, and the duration for which it will be kept. And participants should also understand how their information will be used, such as whether it will be published, disseminated in reports or presentations, or shared for future research purposes. It is also important to describe how the data will be shared, whether it will be in a de identified or anonymized format, such as transcripts, audio recordings, or survey databases. And researchers must explain who will have access to the data and the security measures in place to protect it. This transparency helps build trust and ensures ethical standards around privacy and data protection are upheld. So this section is about the use of collected information. And the final section is about future use and reuse of information. It is also important to inform participants about the future use and potential reuse of data collected during the research. And this includes clearly communicating that their data may be deposited in a repository for future research purpose. And researchers must explain the procedures in place to maintain the confidentiality of the participants' identity and the information they provide, particularly in the context of data archiving and future access. So this is different to the previous section because you are going to inform them about their data being deposited at a third place and what you are going to do with their privacy, confidentiality, and who is going to access their data in the future. So this sort of information should be communicated to them. And participants should be informed about the form in which their data will be stored, whether it will be de-identified, anonymized, audio recordings, survey databases, and so on. So uh, that they understand how their privacy will be protected. And additionally, it should be specified whether any use or access restrictions will apply to the data, such as limitations on commercial use or requirements for safeguarded access by future researchers. And providing this information ensures transparency and support informed decision making about long-term data use. So that's really, really important. This section in the consent form, especially if you plan to share your data. So the next section is about how to seek consent. And consent, you must be aware that consent can be gained in written or oral form. The format of the consent depends on the kind of research, but it is important that whatever format is used, written or verbal, it should be documented. And to do that, you need to document that how it has been gained, what information has been provided, and what the participants have agreed to. And both formats, whether it's written or verbal, have advantages and disadvantages. For example, written consent has more solid legal ground. And for example, you can show that participants have agreed to disclose confidential information. And this is the form that is usually required by ethics committees. And most of all, it offers more protection for researchers as they have written evidence of consent. However, there is a possibility that in some circumstances this cannot be used. For example, such as in illegal activities or some other sort of research. On the other hand, verbal consents are best if recorded, but sometimes it is hard to make all issues clear verbally, and most of all, it can pose greater risk for researchers in regards to adequately providing participant consents, or it may also scare people from participating and have them think that they cannot withdraw their consent. So both have advantages and disadvantages, and I think it depends on the context of the research, what is best for your specific project. So there are no hard and fast rules. And typically, as you're aware, written consent documentation includes an information sheet and a consent form that is signed by the participant. And this division allows the background information to be as detailed as necessary while keeping the signature form short and concise. And information sheet provided to research participants should comprehensively cover key topics to support informed consent and ethical transparency. It is really important, and it should begin by clearly stating the purpose of the research, explaining why the study is being conducted and what it aims to achieve. And it must also describe what participation involves, including any tasks, time commitments, procedures that participants will be asked to undertake. And it should also outline both the potential benefits and the risk, as I mentioned earlier. The information sheet must also explain the procedure for withdrawal, emphasizing that participants can leave the study at any time without any negative consequences. And it should also detail how the collected data will be stored and whether it will be archived for future use or not. That is really important if you plan to share your data. And mentioning the sponsoring institution, the name of the project, contact information for the research team is also important. And it should also inform participants about how they can file a complaint if they have any concerns about the study or their participation. And together, these elements ensure participants are fully informed and can give truly informed consent. And accompanied with this, consent form is a crucial component of ethical research practice and should be written in clear, simple language that is free from any technical jargon to ensure it is easily understood by all participants. And this form should allow participants to clearly indicate their agreement with key statements, such as confirming that they have read and understood the information provided about the research project. And it should also affirm that participants have the opportunity to ask questions and receive satisfactory answers. And more importantly, the form must state that participation is entirely voluntary and that participants have the right to withdraw from the study at any time without needing to provide a reason and without any negative consequences. Um, and the form should also address future uses of data, including possible publication, data sharing, and reuse in other studies. And finally, to validate the consent process, the form must include spaces for the participant and the researcher to sign and date, confirming mutual understanding and agreement to proceed. And this also ensures transparency and ethical accountability throughout the research. If you are collecting personal information during that particular research project, it is also essential to provide participants with clear information on how their data will be handled. And this includes explaining how the personal data will be processed, the methods and system used to store it securely, and how long the data will be retained. And they should also be informed about the specific procedures in place to maintain the confidentiality of their information, including access controls and any data protection protocols in place. And researchers must ensure that all use of personal data aligns with ethical guidelines and that participants' privacy is respected throughout the study. And in case UK GDPR applies or just EU GDPR applies, additional details must be included, and this involves providing the contact information of the data controller, which could include the data protection officer, the REO, or the lead researcher, and it must be made clear who will receive or have access to that personal data, ensuring transparency around data sharing. And participants must be informed of their rights under the GDPR, including their right to access their data, request corrections, or even their data remove. So that is really important. If GDPR applies, then you need to add this to the consent form as well. So there are different methods that can be used to obtain consent. ICO, Information Commissioner Office, has recommended the following. You could use signing a consent statement on a paper form, ticking an opt-in box, or paper or electronically clicking an opt-in button or link online, selecting from equally prominent yes, no options, choosing technical settings or preference dashboard settings, or responding to an email as well, requesting consent and answering yes to a clear oral consent request. And you can see that all of these methods fulfill the conditions that are required for the consent. So yeah, you could use any of these. These are recommended by ICO. So the next section focuses on when to seek consent. Obtaining consent for research participation or for future uses such as publication or for sharing of data can be a one-off occurrence, or it could be an ongoing process. And it always depends on the specific research project, whether you choose for a one-off consent or a process consent. Both approaches have pros and cons. One-off consent is used for taking part in the research project only once, and it is simple and the least hassle to participants, but there are disadvantages, such as sometimes research outputs are not known in advance, and the participants will not know about all the information they will be contributing to. And most of the times, when researchers deposited data with us, they simply do not know at that time when they use the consent form for data collection that they should be informing the participants about data archiving for future use. So this is the disadvantage of one-off consent. So we always advise them to contact them again and obtain a retrospective consent, informing them about the data archiving of their information, but which is not feasible all the time. So yeah, so process consent is requested continuously throughout the research project, and it ensures active consent, but it may not get all consent needed before losing contact, and it can be repetitive for participants, and yeah, it's not feasible all the time. But this is the second type um, that is there. So there are situations where special considerations are needed when seeking consent, but it is not possible to go through these in this workshop. I have added a link at the bottom of the slide for you to have a look later on our website about these contexts when you need to pay special attention in these circumstances when seeking consent. So now something around challenges. Sometimes researchers are faced with the challenges when sharing or archiving data, especially if the data contains personal information and cannot be anonymized. And at the time of data collection, they do not consider obtaining consent for future uses of data, specifically archiving and sharing. I just mentioned that. So in that case, they may consider obtaining retrospective consent. But there is highly likely, if participants cannot be traced, depositing the data in a repository will need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis to identify whether it is appropriate to share it or possibly present it to the ethics board for review and decision. But that is not always the case. We as a repository, trusted repository, we always ask the researchers to obtain retrospective consent, and if they can't, then we can't get that data deposited with us. So we are strict in that sense that we do think that consent is an ethical obligation and it is essential to deposit data with us. So, and then the next challenge could be the right to withdraw. Sometimes participants can ask, sorry, that they wanted to withdraw their data. And if you have already collected it and deposited that data, and especially with the qualitative interviews, transcripts, it is not easily, or if you have anonymized it and deposited data in a repository, it is not easily possible to do that. Especially when there are very less participants, and it could be very damaging for that research. So in that case, researchers can consider for dealing with participants wishing to withdraw, and they could seek a meeting to explain to the participant the cost of this to the project, or they could discuss whether some of the data could be kept or used, or if data can be completely anonymized. So I would say that depends on a case by case basis and the discussions between the participants. Always try to discuss that with the participant, try to convince them. And there are circumstances where no form of consent can be obtained, and these situations are exceptional. And again, they will need case by case review and clear argument to satisfy the requirement of ethic review boards. And there can be varied reasons why consent is not possible. For example, limited capacity may prevent a person from being fully informed, and data may have already been collected for another purpose that did not require consent, such as government administrative data. So consent may not be technically feasible in some very large scale projects. So you can get detailed information regarding this on our website. Yeah, so all of the information is there. I have added a link here. And then participants' perception, or if the uh, your sample comprises of children and vulnerable people, patients, poor awareness of their rights, failure to provide adequate information, or absence of consideration of participants' educational level or cultural background, use of unclear language, all of these can be a challenge. So, in terms of data sharing, if not communicated clearly, participants are skeptical of confidentiality issues. So, always try to think carefully and always open to discussion. So, yeah, these could be some of the challenges. So, now I'll show you some real examples from the consent forms that depositors have used to deposit their data with us. But before that, I think you can break down the information in the consent form into three key areas. Um, Information related to participation in the research, how the information collected and will be used by the researcher, and information about future uses by the researchers. So you can break down all the information that needs to be uh, in the consent form into these three key areas. So this is an extract of the UK Data Service Model Consent Form. I have taken a screenshot for this first section, which is about taking part in the study. And I'll let you read it first. So you can see that this section is about taking part in the study, and it has captured several aspects such as participants have read and understand the information about voluntary participation and about information related to withdrawal. It also explains what they have to do, how information is being collected or if there are any potential risks. So all the items around the research participation can go into this section. It addresses the first key area that I highlighted in the previous slide. So this section is about the use of information being collected, and yeah, I just give you time to read it. So here you can see that it is all about use of information in the study, listing. Researchers are being asked if they can list any planned outputs, reports, publications, or anything about knowledge sharing. And there is an item or clause about personal information. Then if they are using codes in research outputs, so what the use of any information that is being collected. And it also addresses the confidentiality aspect by asking what can or cannot be shared. And this is the final one, which is about informing the participants about future use and reuse of the information or data. So all the information where the data will be deposited, in which form, whether it is anonymized or if available under restrictions. So, so you have seen that this model consent form or template that could be found on our website. I have added a link on the resources slide as well. It addresses all three key areas. You can put some information in the participant information sheet detail and just these brief sentences, dividing them into three key areas here in the consent form. So these are this and some couple of upcoming slides. These are example extracts that have been used in real researches. I'll let you read this. Researchers have used these wording in their consent forms. So this first one is a very nice example that addresses granularity because the researcher has used different formats to collect data. And it also focuses on future uses of data as well. So a very nice example if you have multiple formats. And in the second example, participants are being informed about the future uses such as a report, content of a website, archiving. And here you can see that they have also been told that they may be contacted again if their personal data or a quote or photograph will be used, which shows an active consent or process consent. So that is also a nice example. And this one is another one in which researchers have provided information regarding archiving, who will have access to the data and on what conditions, and it also states the reuse purposes as well. So another nice one. Here, in the first one, they have mentioned, I agree for the data I provide to be archived at UK Data Archive. But I would advise, if you are very certain that you are going to deposit data at a certain repository, then just name it. If you are not certain, we always advise not to name the repository because there may be some conditions that the repository have any policies that they can't accept your data, or you change your mind once the research ended. So it's always advisable not to name the repository. Instead, just say the data, I agree for the data I provide to be archived at a trusted, responsible repository. So in that way, I think you are on the safe side. And here again, you can see that they have informed how confidentiality can be maintained, how personal data will be stored, who can have access to it, and on what conditions, and where it will be stored. So that's another nice example. So this is a screenshot from Health Research Authority. It's a nice example about a blood donation study. And they have combined the consent form and the information sheet together into one document. And on the title page, they have added consent statements addressing most of the conditions we have gone through. And then they have addressed some specific questions that are really, really important. Why is this study needed? What does taking part in the study involve? Why have I been invited? And am I eligible? Do I have to take part? What should I do if I want to take part? What happens during my next donation visit? What will happen to my blood samples? What happens immediately after I enroll? What happens next? Are there any benefits? Are there any risks? How do I withdraw? Who will be able to use my information? Can I know the results? Who is organizing and funding the study? Who has approved the study? What will happen uh, with the results? You can say, what happen if something goes wrong? Who do I contact if I have any concerns? So a very comprehensive information sheet combined with the consent form statements uh, on the very first page. So that's a right nice example. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening. If you can just please go to Padlet and you can scan the QR code. There is an activity for you. They are real consent form statements. Added here, assessing consent form statements. There is a QR code on top left corner as well. I think it is anonymous, so feel free to write what do you think? Yeah, Gail, thank you, Gail. Gail has added a link to the Padlet in the chat. So what do you think about these statements? Are they appropriate, and is there something wrong with them? Any thoughts on them, if you would like to share? I'll give you 10 minutes, I think. Thank you very much for all the responses and assessing these consent form statements that appeared in real consent forms in the research projects that have been submitted to us for depositing here at UK Data Service. But before I begin going through each of the statements, I'm not sure if you have noticed, Padlet has given you some anonymous names to all of you, most of you, I think. So that was quite interesting names to go through when I was going through the statements or going through your comments. So some very nice names given by Padlet. I hope you like it, the name you have been given by the Padlet. So the first one is, I understand that only genuine researchers will have access to this data. Bear in mind that we will discuss these statements in the context of data sharing for future use. So all of the comments, I think you are absolutely right. The term genuine researchers is undefined, and it makes it unclear who qualifies for access. The researcher needs to specify who qualifies as a genuine researcher, whether it's an academic researcher affiliated with recognized institutions or those with ethical approval, so and so on. So such terms should be avoided in the consent forms or in the participant information sheet. So this is a very, very unclear and odd term to be used. And then someone has mentioned that what about citizen scientists, community researchers? Yeah, I think it would apply to these terms as well. So either you define what do you mean by citizen scientists, or what do you mean by community researchers, or they are working in which area of the community. If you define it, then that should be fine. So the second one is, I understand that the information provided will be used in a report and other publications likely to be read by other parents of young children and by teachers and others working on educational issues. So again, true that it is very specific, it's vague, and there is no information how the information will be presented, whether it's anonymous or not. There isn't enough information that is right. So you just need to think, what message is this statement trying to convey? Can we provide more clarity about specifically what information will be used in the report? And do they mean personal details, direct quotes? So yeah, that is absolutely right. All the comments that it is vague and it lacks clarity. Then number three, I understand that only the research team will have access to the data I will provide. So again, I think right, Lee said in the comments that they by using such statement, it precludes data sharing. What about they just ignored data sharing or archiving? So it is important to clarify with participants what data will be shared and who will have access to this, and what information will be seen by the research team. So yeah, that is right. There is a comment that there is a difference between data protection and freedom of information. That is true. And then someone has mentioned that there is no mention of the details of the research team here. Yeah, it should be defined, but overall, this sort of statement should be avoided because it precludes data sharing. So that is the main purpose of this statement here. They may have defined the research team later or in the consent or in the participant information sheet, but such sort of statements should be avoided in the consent forms, especially if you plan to share your data. And these days, more and more funders and journals, they ask you to share your data. Then the next one is number 4. In accordance with the requirement of our university's research ethics committee, data from this project will be destroyed after funding concludes. So this is again, first of all, it's a vague statement. They should have defined what data. Usually it refers to personal data, but it may refer to all data. So do they mean data which will be contained in the research data set as well? So what about funder requirements to deposit and share data? Here again, it is about providing clarity to participants around which data will be deleted specifically and which data will be archived, or they mean all the data. So it lacks clarity. So they should consider what needs to be communicated, and such statements also preclude data sharing. If we come across such statement in the consent form, then we always advise researchers to go back and obtain retrospective consent from the participant, because with such statements in the consent form, it's not possible to deposit data with us. Yeah, and there are comments that it lacks clarity. Um, in a sense that can this be guaranteed? And with such statements, we are not able to comply with the open data recommendations. That's right. And what does destroyed look like in a digital sense? So that needs explaining as well, maybe in the information sheet. So yeah, you can obviously add a link to the university policy, or you can provide a date. But if you plan to share your data for future use, if you say that the data will be destroyed in 5 years, 10 years, you have to do that, because that is being promised to the participants. If you need to be very clear if you are mentioning personal data here. You can say that the personal data will be deleted or destroyed after 5 years or after 10 years. So that is okay. But if you say that the data that is being collected from you will be destroyed in 5 years, 10 years time, then you have to do that unless you obtain a retrospective consent. So for example, the data we hold, it is permanent. We hold data sets in perpetuity. So yeah, that's why we always ask to avoid such statements. And yeah, you need to provide the information when funding will be concluding. And yeah, I thought there is a comment that it is held for 10 years. It is institutional policy. There is no specific period, standard period, whether it's 3 year, 5 year, 10 year. It all depends on individual institutions. So always check with your institution, and always be very clear if you are writing about personal data, all data, and if you are planning to share your data, or if you are complying to open data policies, then just avoid these sorts of statements, or be very clear what you are going to do with the data. And the next one, number 5, I agree to participate in this study and to have my audio and visual data used for analysis reports and presentations. So as you have mentioned in the comments that depending on the project, it may be more appropriate to break this down into subcategories, offering the participant more choice, such as to have their data used for analysis and reports, but not in presentations. And this statement also does not explain whether their data will directly identify them or be a direct quotation from them. So it is therefore important for the information sheet to provide more context and guidance here, as some of you have mentioned. So yeah, that is right. Number 6, any information I give will be used for research only and will not be used for any other purpose. So statements like this also prohibit the reuse of data for teaching and learning purposes. And what information do we mean specifically here? Statements such as for research, teaching, and learning purposes are better in permitting other uses of data. So yeah, as some of you have mentioned that this does sound very exclusive and hard to do, because it limits the use of data, and it is somewhat vague, as some of the comments have mentioned. So yeah, how the data might be used, and could it potentially prevent the results from being used to inform changes in care or practice? Exactly. Yeah, so you need to be very careful with the statements you used in the consent forms, and especially in the context of data sharing. So thank you very much. Somebody is still writing here. So yeah, thank you very much for the responses. Let's get back to the presentation slides. Yeah, so the takeaway message from today's workshop is, again, as I mentioned last week, do not collect personal data if it is not essential, and indicate clearly in a consent form where the participant's consent is being asked for processing their personal data, and where consent is being asked for taking part in the research. And as I showed you, 3 key areas should be there. And if you plan to share the data, then the third one, use of information for by future uses of information by other researchers, is the most important one. So this should be clearly indicated in the consent form. And always keep consent forms under review. And most importantly, in the context of data sharing, indicate the future uses of data, which is really, really important, as you have seen in those consent form statements. We also have a mini module on our website. There is, I've inserted this link here. It's quite a quick one, and it's nicely described the role of informed consent in data sharing. So you can have a look at that later on. I have added some resources here on this slide, including the UKDS model consent form example information sheet that I have gone through, this HRA example consent form and sheet. And then there is a consent form visit from Daria that is quite good. And some information on regulating access to data, consent for data sharing. So you can have a look at all these resources. They are really useful. So yeah, any project related specific question, you can either email me or you can add it to the Padlet. So I'll keep the Padlet open for another 48 hours. Thank you very much.